I'd like to introduce Ruby Paul. She's going to be presenting on Evolve or Die, How I Stopped Avoiding and Started Loving Python Upgrades. Let's give her a warm round of applause.
Thank you, thank you. I want you to imagine that you're getting ready to board a flight and you've got your book, you've got the snack you want, you settle into your seat, and the pilot says, in that reassuring and very confident voice, everything's going to be okay. But everything was not okay for hundreds of thousands of passengers last holiday season. As you might recall, a major airline canceled about 17,000 flights. Let's call it North, South, East, West Airlines. The main source of the cancellation was outdated software in a crew scheduling system, so pilots didn't know which planes they were supposed to be flying. The cost of delaying that upgrade was a 15% drop in share price, $400 million in lost revenue, and $300 million in estimated traveler compensation, not to mention unquantifiable reputational damage. So from an airline disruption to you, to us, what is the delay and upgrade going to cost us? I'm here to hopefully inspire you to stop delaying upgrades and start embracing them. And every step in my quite unique professional journey has led me here. I started off researching efficiency as an economics researcher and lecturer. Then I started developing software about 10 years ago, and I've been a founder for about 5 years. So how many people have either implemented an upgrade personally or at least observed a team going through an upgrade? Okay, that is the majority of the room. So you're already familiar with many of the challenges in an upgrade, specifically a Python upgrade. Maybe some of you even survived the Python 2 to 3 upgrade, right? I believe that there are some anti-patterns that have developed in our community surrounding upgrades that can be explained by behavioral themes. And I'm also going to share some good news, some upgrade tools and solutions that can help us combat these anti-patterns. So using end-of-life software has been a dirty little secret in our community for a very long time, and that time is over. Regulators are now aware of the risks to our infrastructure from using end-of-life software, and they're taking action. So for example, the SEC has proposed a rule not only requiring vulnerability tracking systems, but specifically vulnerabilities regarding end-of-life software use. So one of the biggest impediments to upgrading, from speaking with people, is the risk of the unknown. And this is certainly a common risk and a common fear for humans in general, not just with regards to software upgrades. Most of the time, I would say, an upgrade is really left to the development team to advocate for, right? And so we're dealing with unknowns in our code base. Will the version of Python I want to get to even be supported by the packages I'm using? How much time is it going to take? And how am I going to convince perhaps the business side that this is worth it? There are a lot of unknowns, and those are valid. We know that there are serious risks to not upgrading, specifically when it comes to security, right? There's also the risk your application could simply stop working, especially if you're relying on other services in the platform you're using. And of course, it slows development, not to mention there are performance issues when you delay upgrades. So how many people, raise your hand, think 3.7 is now a deprecated Python version? Okay, about half the room. How many people think 3.8 is also deprecated at this time. Okay, so 3.7 was deprecated over a year ago by the Python Software Foundation, and 3.8 is going to be deprecated in a few months in October. How many people here have either used NumPy or at least have heard of NumPy? Okay, everyone. All right, so this is data from PyStats. It's the number of NumPy downloads by Python minor version. So on the left, you can see almost 2 million downloads of NumPy for 3.7. This is from last week, okay? That is a bit scary. And over 1.5 million downloads for 3.8, which, as I just mentioned, is going to be deprecated in a few months. So relying on end-of-life software is a problem in our community. Now, we all know that generally, out-of-date software poses security risks. This is a non-exhaustive list of the security problems that can happen on end-of-life software. So injection attacks, access control hacks, data breaches, and what's even perhaps less clear is that you could be running 3.8.10, for example, and that's not deprecated yet, it's still supported. However, 3.8.10 has a flaw in the URL lib that leaves you open to injection attacks. So not only do you have to keep track of staying ahead of deprecations, but you even have to monitor which patch version you're on to make sure you're not leaving yourself open to these kind of attacks. So practically speaking, if you're on Heroku, 3.8 and 3.9 have already actually been deprecated. In 3 months, 3.8 is going to be deprecated on Azure and on AWS. Well, so what are some of the good sides of upgrading? Well, obviously heightened security. Also performance gains. Some versions of Python are 60% faster than the previous one. I mean, that's a huge way to get performance gains in a pretty direct route. And then obviously access to new features, right? Those can really help us code more efficiently. So here's the thing. Before you joined me this morning, you already knew, generally, not upgrade bad, upgrade good, right? You might not have known about the specific patch versions and the libraries that are open to specific vulnerabilities, but you had a general sense that I should upgrade, right? So why don't we do that then? Well, I think there are some behavioral issues at work. How many people have heard of risk aversion? Okay, you might have heard the term risk-loving, risk-averse, risk-neutral. There are several types of aversion, many aversions out there. We're going to focus on ambiguity aversion for a moment. So ambiguity aversion contrasts the known risks of, in our context, a status quo. That would mean staying on the version we're in, versus the unknown risks of change, and that would mean upgrading to a newer supported version. The idea of ambiguity aversion can basically be summed up in better the devil I know than the devil I don't, right? And we're assuming that we know the probabilities of outcomes for the known, for the status quo, and we don't know the probability of all the outcomes for the unknown. So that should bring up two things. One, if I don't know the probability of outcomes of the unknown, how do I know that the unknown might not actually be better on average, right? I just said I don't know what the probabilities are, but we tend to overemphasize basically overemphasize the bad things that could happen with the unknown rather than balance with the good things that could happen. Specifically, when it comes to upgrades, we might say, well, I know what could happen if I don't upgrade. There could be a security breach, my app could stop working, it could just get really slow, but we also don't actually know the probabilities of those outcomes, do we? Even the platforms that we're all using, when they're giving out instructions about deprecations, they themselves say, we don't know the probability your application is going to keep working with the other services. And so if they don't know, we certainly don't. So we can sometimes lie to ourselves is what I'm saying. So those are risks that we need to evaluate, and we need to get more information before we assume that the unknown is going to be worse. There's also a framework called the principal-agent model. And this is a framework in which a principal delegates a task to an engineer, in our example. So an engineering manager could be the principal, and the agent is a developer that's doing development. So the principal doesn't have as much information about the development task as the engineer actually doing the work does. So in a classic principal-agent model, the problem comes up that there are going to be, let's say, two types of engineers, a productive type and an unproductive type. And the productive engineer can mimic the behavior of an unproductive type and essentially coast and have a really nice laid-back lifestyle because the principal, the engineering manager, doesn't have perfect insight into what it actually takes to do the job, okay? So remember that. The second concept is moral hazard. Now, we're most used to hearing this in, like car insurance is probably the most talked about example. And so the idea is, well, one idea is that I'm a risky driver and I have more information about my risk than the insurance company has about how risky I am. That is one issue, but that's not moral hazard. The other issue that can come up is once I have an insurance policy, I drive in a more risky manner because I've already transferred the risk to the insurance company. That's what moral hazard is, doing something different, okay? So now let's come back to our engineer and our engineering manager. The engineer knows, now you know, Python is going to be deprecated in 3.8, right? And you know that you should upgrade. You also know that your manager does not fully understand what this is going to take, and you might not even have all that information until you get into it, as of now anyway. So you may decide not to upgrade because you don't want to appear to be a less productive type. So it can work the other way. And so from the point of view of the manager, you'd actually be taking on more risk than the manager would like because you don't want to avoid appearing to be unproductive. And so that is a problem that's fueled by these information gaps. If you and your manager actually had one better information and the same information, this situation wouldn't exist. So what upgrades are we delaying? What are those delays going to cost us? And are there tools available to help mitigate those risks? So I have been on a mission to close the information gap and to reduce uncertainty about upgrades. I've developed this cool tool called Version Up, and it's supposed to give you a risk audit of your code, flag dependencies that have deprecated modules within them, and also let you know if the version you want to move to is supported by some of your packages, and then what to do. So try to make it very accessible. A project manager could use this. You don't have to be technical to use this. You just have to give them read access to your repo so they can pull the lock file or the requirements.txt file. So you simply indicate what version of Python you're using, and you upload the file. If you want to get your hands dirty and you want to try this, you can scan this and then just click on beta and go from there. And that'll be a way for you to give us feedback. You can try it out on your own repos and learn about what's happening in your code base. So there are essentially data sets that power this. One data set is the Python standard library module index. We've scraped and parsed and made it very pretty and put it into tables, and we've augmented that with a deprecation status flag that tells us which modules in which Python versions are deprecated. We have a second data source based on packages. So the most popular Python packages are included in here, and we've got data on which modules are used within those packages, whether those libraries are third-party or come from the standard library, and the objects that are imported into those libraries, so you can get detailed information about how deprecations might be affecting the packages that you're using. Also, if you've developed tools internally, you could learn about modules that you might be using explicitly that have been deprecated. So this is one of the screens that comes from inputting we're using poetry, our poetry lock file. We're doing an upgrade from 3.10 to 3.11, so you can, I should mention, version up is coded in Python, and what you're looking at is Django. That's the web application, okay? So you can see that we've got, in urllib3, that's a package we're using, distutils has been deprecated. It's also very helpful to know how long a deprecation has been in place. As you know, the Python maintainers decide when to actually remove a module, and that is not a clearly defined function. So the best we can do is say, the longer something's been deprecated, the sooner the removal is actually happening. So Setup Tools has the imp module that has been deprecated for 5 years. So from this, I know that the maintainers of Setup Tools are going to have to make a change pretty soon. And since I'm using Setup Tools, I'm going to have to make a change to another version. Not only that, if I've used the import module in developing some of our internal libraries, which we have done, I now know that I need to change to using the import lib. And I've heard a couple of talks this weekend talking about import lib, so I know that people are aware of this. So you have a series of actions that have come basically from parsing the changelog so that you know what's happening around the modules you're using in the packages that you're using. So if this weren't done, I would have to read through the changelog, make a note of every module that's been affected, then search through my package documentation. We're using at least 20 packages for those modules. This would be an exhausting exercise. Not only that, it's inefficient in a global sense because how many people in here are using setup tools or requests, right? Like everyone. So everyone is going through this inefficient exercise. So we've done this once, and you can simply upload your lock file, your requirements file, and get the information you need about what's happening in your code. Another really important piece of an upgrade is knowing whether the packages I'm using are supporting the version of Python I want to get to. As you know, many packages are maintained by volunteers, and they don't always have all the resources. So this is another thing that has to be done manually I would suggest, before you actually upgrade, to figure out if your packages actually support the next version of Python you want to get to. So we're using about 20 packages for the web app in any case, and now I'm being told that 9 of them I don't have to look up. I already know, version up has already told me that these are explicitly supporting 3.11. There will be a list of packages that aren't supported, and so at least I know that, and then I can go do the manual search in the documentation to figure that out. This is my favorite part, because I hate writing up JIRA cards. So there is an export function, and all this data you see has been automatically generated. So this is a task that's been created for me to deal with the deprecated modules. So it lists the modules and the packages they support, and it's telling me, hey, you need to look in your code base to figure out how this is going to affect you. And also, we've developed a time estimator. So it's obviously a function of the number of deprecations you have, and this is just a jumping off point to start conversations with your team to figure out when you can fit this into your sprints, but at least it's on the board for you. So if you're someone who likes to get dirty with the data, or maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, I have another problem that data like this could solve. Well, we've put this data on Snowflake, actually. We've got 3.6 through 3.12 those standard library module indices have been parsed. And again, it's augmented with a deprecation flag, a unique identifier, the links to the documentation of the modules, and a description of the modules, among other data pieces. So you can use these as you like. For the packages, again, they have all the modules that the packages rely on, and also the import path. So if you want to get really specific about which functions or methods you're using in your code base, you could do that as well. It also has a flag on whether the library is part of the standard library or not. So the two types of data that are on Snowflake right now are the Python standard library modules. And so you can do diffs to track modules that have been removed or modules that have been added or simply deprecated. And with the package data, you can check where your dependency might be on third-party modules and evaluate the risk to your code base in that way. So for example, questions you might want to answer. Which modules are deprecated in the packages I use? How dependent am I on deprecated modules across packages? And which third-party standard modules do I rely on? So this is a screenshot of Snowflake. And what I've done here is joined the setup tools package data table with the 3.11 standard library module. And I've only focused on modules that are deprecated. And so what I know now is that in setup tools, there are 3 deprecated modules: distutils, msilib, and imp. Okay? We're using requests. And so we want to assess the risk that we've introduced by using requests and other packages. So this is a very simple query. I'm just looking at the requests table and selecting any modules or any dependencies that have the isStandard library flag as false. And so you can see here that the top 3 that come up are Botto3, Botto Core, and S3 transfer. So if you're not familiar with those are maintained by the AWS community. So I'm pretty confident that those are going to continue to be maintained. And so I'm not too worried about the risk introduced to my application from requests depending on these 3. However, you might not be able to see this, there are 3 more down here that are not necessarily maintained by large corporations. So I might want to dig into the community support for those libraries. So I don't know, some people aren't so great with SQL, but you don't have to be. We've actually provided the SQL queries for you. So this one is just looking at the NumPy table, and this just tells you, hey, which modules have been added to NumPy between these 2 versions, 1.21 and 1.26, okay? So the package tables can have several versions of the same package in them. And so you might say, well, we haven't changed what we're relying on for our application, but that doesn't mean the packages you're using haven't changed their dependencies and therefore indirectly introduced risk into your application, okay? So, and if there's a query you want to do and you're not sure how, you can also just reach out and we'll just add it to the documentation, okay? So what we're trying to do is help people assess and size what their upgrade tasks look like. And you may feel that there are checks you'd like to run, automated checks that you'd like to implement that the web app doesn't necessarily do. And so you can create your own just by accessing the data directly. Now, the changelog data has not been added to Snowflake yet, but it will be. It's in the web app, but we have it's a whole thing to get data on Snowflake, so we will be doing that shortly. But really, if you're trying to maybe speak to the business side about an upgrade, you might want to emphasize that this is going to promote, continuity and consistency. It's going to reduce the probability of an application break. And those reputational hits are really hard to come back from. So those might be points you can make to the business side. So There are 3 things I want you to take away from today. 1, there are imminent deprecations coming up in the Python world, and so a plan is wanting to deal with those deprecations. 2, it is very common to be scared of doing an upgrade. And just remember that when you're considering the status quo versus making a change, our bodies tend to scream all the things that could go wrong with the change, and we tend to be pretty silent on all the things that can go wrong with the status quo. And so you may not be making a truly balanced decision or a truly informed decision. So just be aware of that bias. And then lastly, there are tools and data sets available to help you reduce the unknown about that step you need to take. And we would be happy to have you use our beta product and give us even more feedback about what could help close that information gap. So thank you so much for participating out today. And I would love to hear if you have a special use case. I want to hear about it. I'll be right here, and I'll be happy to talk about questions. Thank you.